The silence was a physical weight. It pressed down on the sterile white platform, seeped into the marrow of his bones, and filled the space where a name should have been. He was not a person. He was Asset 734, and his value was being calculated in the quiet hum of data streams, in the subtle shifts of unseen bodies in the viewing gallery above. The air, recycled and chilled to a precise 68 degrees, tasted of ozone and antiseptic, a flavor he had known longer than he had known his own mother's face. He stood with his spine unnaturally straight, a posture drilled into him by corrective jolts and years of rigid discipline. His hands were clasped behind his back, the knuckles white. He was dressed in a simple grey tunic that did nothing to hide the lean, scarred musculature beneath. Scars were flaws. Flaws reduced value. But his particular flaws were part of the catalogue, listed under conditioning history as proof of his resilience, his volatility, his potential. The auctioneer's voice, a smooth, disembodied baritone amplified by hidden speakers, began the litany. Lot 117, Asset 734, genetic lineage classified, origin point, sector gamma post-pacification, aptitude designation, empathic resonance, class 4, volatility, index 9.7. A murmur rippled through the gallery, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. A volatility index that high was rare. It meant he was powerful but also dangerous, unpredictable. A risk. Most buyers preferred compliance. They wanted soldiers, laborers, companions, beings whose wills had been meticulously scraped away until only function remained. He was not function. He was a barely contained cataclysm, a storm held behind a thin pane of glass. Asset is fully responsive to standard alpha-level command imprinting, the voice continued, a lie so smooth it almost felt like truth. He was responsive, yes, but only because the alternative was a pain that unmade the world. Inside, where they couldn't see, where their scanners couldn't reach, he was a chaotic sea of feeling, a mirror reflecting the cold ambition, the greed, the detached curiosity of the unseen figures watching him. He could feel them. It was his curse, his gift, a dull thrum of collective desire, a sharp spike of avarice from a corporate bidder, the low predatory hum of a military contractor. He kept his own emotions locked in a lead-lined box in his chest, a technique he'd perfected in the solitary dark of his containment cell. To feel was to be vulnerable. To be vulnerable was to be broken. Again. Bidding will commence at 5 million standard credits. The number was meaningless. It was a sound, like the drip of water or the buzz of a failing light. His life had been a series of transactions he had no part in. He was a commodity, passed from the reclamation teams to the conditioning centers, from the evaluators to the auction block. This was just another transfer of ownership, another master, another cage. The bidding began, a rapid, sterile exchange of numbers. 6 million. 7.5. The figures climbed, detached from the reality of the flesh and bone they were purchasing. He kept his eyes fixed on a point on the opposite wall, a place where the seamless white paneling met the floor. He focused on the line, on its perfect, unyielding geometry. It was a small anchor in the overwhelming sea of sensation. Then, a new feeling entered the chaotic symphony. It was different. It was not the hot, grasping greed or the cold, calculating interest he was used to. This was quiet, a stillness, a focused intensity that cut through the noise like a shard of obsidian. It was a mind of immense control, a will like forged steel. It felt like winter. He instinctively recoiled from it, the internal shields he maintained flaring to life. The sensation was unnerving, analytical, yet underneath its glacial surface there was something else, a resonance he couldn't name, a deep, hollow ache that vibrated on a frequency dangerously close to his own. He risked a glance upward, sweeping his gaze across the polarized glass of the viewing gallery. He could see nothing but faint silhouettes, humanoid shapes distorted by the light, but he knew where the feeling was coming from. A single point in the center of the gallery, a void of perfect calm in the midst of the clamor. 15 million, the auctioneer's voice announced, a hint of surprise in its modulated tone. The other bidders had fallen silent. The number hung in the air, heavy and absolute. A new voice spoke, not from the auctioneer's speakers, but directly into the sonic field of the room. It was crisp, clear, and carried an authority that commanded absolute silence. 20 million, and the bid is final. There was no counter. The other bidders, whoever they were, recognized a power they could not challenge. The new feeling in the gallery, the winter-cold presence, did not waver. It remained fixed on him, a scalpel-like focus that stripped him bare. He felt a tremor run through him, a crack in his carefully constructed composure. This was not a standard acquisition. This was something else. Sold, the auctioneer declared, the sound of the digital gavel echoing like a closing cell door. To Administrator Kalen of the Ministry of Internal Compliance. The name meant nothing to him, but the title sent a chill colder than the room's air through his veins. Internal Compliance. They were the ones who purged defective assets. They were the ones who enforced the system's brutal architecture. They were not buyers. They were executioners. The stasis field around his platform dissolved with a soft hiss. 2 guards in pristine white armor entered the room, their movements economical and precise. They flanked him, their energy rifles held in a low-ready position. They did not touch him. His file would have warned them against physical contact. A new door slid open in the wall, revealing a man. Was tall, dressed in a severe black uniform that was the stark antithesis of the room's sterile white. His hair was the color of silver, cut with military precision. His face was a study in controlled neutrality, all sharp angles and pale skin. But his eyes were a startling glacial blue. They were the source of the stillness, the winter he had felt. It was him, Administrator Kalen. He walked toward the platform, his polished black boots making no sound on the floor. The guards tensed, but he gave them a subtle, dismissive gesture. He stopped a few feet from ASAT 734, his gaze unwavering. It was not the look of a master assessing new property. It was the look of a scientist observing a volatile, fascinating specimen, or perhaps a predator studying its prey. Asset 734, Kalen said. His voice was the same one that had placed the final bid, calm, resonant, and utterly devoid of inflection. You will come with me. He did not wait for a response. He turned and walked back toward the open door, expecting to be obeyed. It was the ultimate expression of power. For a fleeting second, defiance sparked in the asset's chest. A wild, desperate urge to lash out, to shatter the suffocating control of the room, to make this cold, quiet man feel the chaos that raged inside him. But he crushed it. He had learned long ago that defiance only ever led to more pain. He was not a person. He was an asset, and an asset did what it was told. With the guards following close behind, he stepped off the platform and followed Administrator Kalen into an unknown future. The man's winter-cold presence, a chilling promise of a new, more sophisticated kind of cage. The transport was a silent, featureless vessel, gliding through the city's transit tubes with a low thrum that vibrated through the floor plates. Elian, he had a name. Once, a whisper in the back of his mind he clung to in the dark, sat on a hard metal bench, his hands cuffed in front of him with energy manacles that hummed with latent power. Kalen sat opposite him, perfectly still, his glacial blue eyes fixed on him. The silence between them was not empty. It was a dense, charged thing, filled with the unspoken weight of the transaction that had just occurred. Elian could feel the man's mind, not its thoughts, but its shape. It was a fortress, walled and guarded, every process logical and deliberate. Yet he could sense the faint vibrations of something else deep within, the echo of that hollow ache he'd felt in the auction house. It was a dissonance that put him on edge. The system did not produce men with aches. It produced men like the guards who stood impassively by the transport door, their inner worlds as blank and sterile as their armor. Kalen was an anomaly, and anomalies were dangerous. The restraints are a formality, Kalen said suddenly, his voice cutting through the low hum of the transport. A requirement of the transfer protocol. They will be removed when we reach our destination. Elian did not respond. He kept his gaze lowered, focused on the faint shimmer of the energy cuffs around his wrists. Acknowledging the statement would be a concession, an acceptance of a dialogue he did not want. To speak was to reveal. To be silent was to endure. Kalen seemed unperturbed by his lack of response. Your designation is Asset 734. Is that what you prefer to be called? The question was unexpected. No one had ever asked for his preference. He was a number, a label, a string of data in a file. The name Elian was a contraband thought, a shard of a former self he had to keep hidden. To speak it aloud would be to offer it up to be taken, to be catalogued, and perhaps erased. He remained silent. I see, Kalen said, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in his tone. It wasn't frustration. It was confirmation, as if Elian's silence was the answer to a different question entirely. Your file states that you have been in the consortium's care for 12 standard years since the pacification of Sector Gamma. It lists 3 failed integration attempts and 7 reconditioning cycles. It describes your empathic resonance as unstable and hazardous to handlers. He recited the information calmly, as if reading a technical manual. Each word was a stone, rebuilding the walls of the prison inside Elian's mind. He remembered the care, the cold rooms, the needles, the neural dampeners that felt like his soul was being scraped out with a rusty spoon. He remembered the handlers, their fear and anger washing over him in sickening waves just before they triggered the pain collars. They broke you, Kalen stated, not with pity, but with a chillingly detached accuracy. And when you did not fit the desired mold, they decided to sell you to the highest bidder, hoping your volatility could be weaponized or simply disposed of by a less discerning client. Elian's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Kalen's for the first time. A spark of raw fury, hot and bright, broke through his control. He had not been broken. He had been honed. He had survived. He had learned to hide the core of himself so deep that their machines and their tortures couldn't find it. Kalen's expression did not change, but Elian felt a flicker of something from him, a sliver of satisfaction. He had provoked a reaction. He had found a crack in the armor. The transport began to decelerate, its hum lowering in pitch. "We have arrived," Kalen announced, standing with a fluid, economical motion. The doors slid open to reveal not a military compound or a sterile laboratory, but the polished obsidian floor of a private landing bay. The air here was different, still filtered, but with a faint, clean scent, like rain on cold stone. They were high up. Elian could feel the vast, empty space beyond the bay walls. Kalen led him from the transport, through a stark, minimalist corridor, and into a security airlock. With a soft chime, Kalen pressed his thumb to a biometric panel. "Administrator Kalen," a synthesized female voice announced. "Identity confirmed. Welcome home." Home. The word was alien. The inner doors slid open, and Elian stopped, his breath catching in his throat. They were in a vast, open-plan living space. One entire wall was a sheet of transparent armor glass, revealing a breathtaking panorama of the city below. Neo-Corinth, a sprawling metropolis of towering spires and rivers of light, stretched to the horizon. He had only ever seen the sky in brief, tantalizing glimpses through the grated windows of transports or conditioning cells. He had never seen it like this, a bruised purple canopy pricked with the first stars of evening and the distant glow of orbital stations. It was a vista of impossible freedom, and it was being shown to him from inside a cage of breathtaking luxury. The apartment was a masterpiece of cold, elegant design, polished chrome, dark wood, and grey stone. It was impeccably clean, obsessively ordered. There was not a single object out of place. It was the home of a man who craved absolute control. "The restraints," Kalen said, his voice close behind him. Elian tensed as Kalen stepped forward, producing a small cylindrical device. He touched it to the cuffs. They hissed and deactivated, falling away from his wrists. The sudden absence of their weight and energy field was disorienting. He rubbed his raw skin, the faint red marks a testament to his long captivity. He was untethered, unrestrained in an open room with a man who had purchased him. The ingrained conditioning screamed at him. This was a test, a trap. Any sudden movement, any sign of aggression would be met with swift and overwhelming force. "There are no guards here," Kalen said, seeming to read his thoughts. "There are no containment fields. You are not a prisoner." The statement was so absurd, so contrary to every experience of his life, that Elian almost laughed. The sound that escaped him was a harsh, dry rasp. "Then what am I?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "You are the subject of an experiment," Kalen replied without hesitation, his honesty more disarming than any lie. He gestured toward a low-slung sofa that faced the window. "A personal project. I am decommissioning you." Decommissioning, a word used for obsolete machinery, for weapons being taken out of service. "You mean you are terminating me," Elian said, the words flat and cold. "If that was my intention, Asset 734, I would have had it done at the auction house. It would have been far more efficient." Kalen moved to a recessed panel in the wall, which slid open to reveal a small kitchen. He retrieved a glass and filled it with water. "The purpose of this exercise is to see if what the consortium breaks can be repaired, to see if a being stripped of its identity can reclaim it. I bought you to set you free." He walked back and offered the glass of water. Elian stared at it. It was a simple gesture, an offering. In his world, nothing was offered. Everything was taken or given with conditions. He looked from the glass to Kalen's impassive face. This was the most dangerous man he had ever met, not because of his authority or his clear capacity for violence, but because of the game he was playing. He was offering hope, a concept more lethal than any weapon. Hope made you careless. Hope made you vulnerable. "And once I am repaired?" Elian asked, his voice a low whisper. "What then?" "Then you will walk out that door and never see me again," Kalen said, his blue eyes holding Elian's. "You will be given a new identity, a clean slate. You will be free." Elian did not take the water. He didn't believe a word of it. The consortium did not relinquish its property. Men like Kalen did not perform acts of charity. This was a lie, a beautiful, intricate, and utterly terrifying lie. "Why?" Elian forced the word out. Kalen's expression tightened for a fraction of a second, the only break in his composure Elian had yet seen. The winter in his eyes deepened. The hollow ache Elian had sensed from him pulsed, a silent scream in the quiet of the room. "Because the system I serve is flawed," Kalen said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It creates monsters and it discards masterpieces. I wish to understand the cost." He placed the glass of water on a low table between them. "Your new life begins with a choice. Drink the water or don't. The choice is yours." He turned and walked toward a different section of the apartment, disappearing down a corridor and leaving Elian alone in the vast, silent room with the glittering city spread out before him like a fallen constellation. Elian stood frozen, his body vibrating with a dozen conflicting instincts. Flee, fight, submit. The conditioning warred with a primal urge for self-preservation. He looked at the door. He could try. He could run. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that the building's security would be insurmountable. He would be apprehended before he reached the end of the corridor, and Kalen would watch, his expression unchanged as another experiment yielded its data. His gaze fell to the glass of water. It was such a small thing, clear, clean, simple, but in this room, in this moment, it was everything. It was a test of trust, a symbol of a choice he had never been allowed to make. Slowly, his muscles unknotting one by one, he walked to the table. His hand trembled as he reached for the glass. He lifted it, the cool weight of it solid and real in his palm. He brought it to his lips and drank. The water was cold and pure. It tasted like nothing, and like the first hint of rain after a long and unforgiving drought. It was not freedom, not yet, but it was a beginning, and for the first time in 12 years, the possibility of an end that was not termination felt terrifyingly, dangerously real. The days that followed blurred into a strange, rhythmic pattern of silence and sensory immersion. Kalen was a ghost in his own home. He would be present in the mornings, seated at a large, dark wood desk in a corner of the main living area, his attention focused on a translucent data slate. He never spoke to Elian unless Elian initiated it, which he did not. The administrator would then leave for long periods, the apartment falling into an even deeper quiet, leaving Elian to navigate the gilded cage alone. It was a methodical process of deconditioning, Elian realized, a slow, deliberate dismantling of the prison in his mind. The first test had been the water. The next was food. On the second day, Kalen did not bring him a nutrient paste packet as he would have received in the facility. Instead, he gestured to the kitchen unit. The replicator is calibrated to your nutritional needs, but it also has a full culinary library. You may choose what you eat. Elian stared at the sleek, seamless panel. He had no frame of reference. Food was fuel, consumed for efficiency. The concept of choosing it for pleasure was alien. He stood before the machine for an hour, paralyzed by the sheer volume of choice, until hunger gnawed at his stomach. Finally, he simply pressed the first option his finger landed on. An apple materialized in the dispenser slot with a soft chime. It was red, impossibly so, with a glossy sheen. He had seen images of such things in instructional data, but had never held one. He picked it up. It was heavy, solid. He bit into it. The crunch was loud in the silent apartment. The explosion of sweet, tart juice on his tongue was a shock to his system. It was overwhelming. He ate the entire thing, core and all, not out of hunger, but out of a desperate need to understand the sensation. It was the first real thing he had tasted in over a decade. Kalen watched him from his desk, his face unreadable, making a small notation on his slate. Elian felt a surge of resentment. He was still a specimen. His reaction was just another data point for Administrator Kalen's project. He retreated to the room he had been given, a space as minimalist and controlled as the rest of the apartment, with a bed that was little more than a slab with a thin mattress, and a window that looked out onto the same stunning cityscape. He spent hours there, sitting on the floor, trying to rebuild the walls in his mind that this place and this man were so intent on tearing down. Kalen introduced other stimuli with the same detached precision. Music was next. One evening, a soft, complex melody filled the apartment. It was a string instrument, a cello, its notes full of a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical touch. Elian froze, his hand halfway to his mouth with a piece of replicated bread. The sound bypassed his defenses. It resonated with the tightly coiled knot of pain in his own chest, making it vibrate, threatening to unravel. He felt his eyes burn, an unfamiliar stinging sensation. He stood up and walked stiffly to his room, closing the door to shut out the sound. But he could still hear it, a melancholy ghost seeping through the walls. He sat on his bed, his fists clenched, fighting a battle against an enemy he couldn't see. He was losing. His empathic sense, long suppressed by dampeners and his own iron will, was beginning to stir in this quiet, controlled environment. It was like a limb that had been asleep for years, slowly, painfully, waking with a pins and needles agony. He could feel Kalen more clearly now. The administrator was a paradox. His surface thoughts were a tightly controlled loop of logic, analysis, and observation. But underneath, the hollow ache was a constant, low thrum. It was grief, a grief so old and deep it had become part of his foundation. It was a cold, dead star at the center of his personal galaxy. One day, Elian found a book left on the low table in the living room. It was bound in actual leather, not synth hide, and the pages were made of paper, thin and delicate. He opened it. It was poetry. The words were strange, arranged in patterns that made no logical sense, but evoked powerful, disorienting images and feelings. He read a line, "The cage of my ribs cannot hold my heart." He slammed the book shut, his own heart hammering against his ribs. He felt exposed, as if the book had been chosen specifically to dissect him. He looked for Kalen, but the administrator was gone. The book remained on the table, a silent invitation, a weapon disguised as art. He began to feel as though he were a ghost haunting the edges of Kalen's life. He would watch the administrator perform his morning routine, a series of precise physical exercises, a Spartan meal, the methodical donning of his severe black uniform. Kalen moved with a quiet efficiency that left no room for wasted motion or extraneous thought. He was a man who had stripped his own existence down to its essential components: function, control, purpose. But sometimes, in the dead of night, Elian would be woken by a subtle shift in the apartment's emotional atmosphere. He would creep from his room and see Kalen standing before the great window, a silhouette against the city's endless lights. In those moments, the administrator's formidable mental shields would thin, and the grief would pour out of him, a silent, cryogenic wave of loss. It was vast and desolate. It was the feeling of a man standing alone in the wreckage of his own life. During one of these nocturnal vigils, Elian felt the grief sharpen, coalesce around a specific memory. It was fragmented, indistinct, but it had a name attached to it: Liam. The name was a wound. Elian retreated to his room, the phantom pain of Kalen's sorrow clinging to him. He was becoming an unwilling confessor, a receptacle for the administrator's repressed trauma. The thought was terrifying. His empathy had always been a vulnerability, a gateway for others' pain to become his own. The handlers had used it against him, flooding him with their own rage and fear to break his will. He had learned to shut it down, to become a stone. But Kalen's grief was different. It didn't attack him. It seeped into him, a slow, cold tide, and resonated with the hollow spaces inside himself. The carefully constructed piece of the apartment was shattered a week into his stay. Elian was in the main room, staring out the window, when a chime sounded. Kalen, who was working at his desk, stiffened. A section of the wall opposite the window became opaque, then flickered to life, displaying the face of a woman. She was beautiful, with sharp, intelligent features and dark hair pulled back in a severe style. She wore the same uniform as Kalen, but with a higher-ranking insignia on the collar. Her smile was thin and sharp, like a crack in ice. "Kalen," she said, her voice smooth and cultured. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten your old mentor." Kalen's face was a mask of professional neutrality, but Elian felt a jolt of ice-cold alarm from him. It was fear, controlled, suppressed, but undeniably fear. "Director Valerius," he replied, his voice even. "An unscheduled call. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Pleasure is such a bourgeois concept," she purred, her eyes scanning the room behind Kalen, lingering for a fraction of a second on the spot where Elian stood, just out of the camera's direct line of sight. "I'm calling about your recent acquisition. Asset 734. A curious purchase. Even for you. 20 million credits for a volatile, unstable empath." The board was intrigued. "It was a discretionary fund purchase," Kalen said coolly. "The asset is being studied for potential applications in psychological warfare dampening. Its instability is the key variable." It was a masterful lie, delivered with perfect conviction. But Elian could feel the frantic, high-speed calculations happening behind Kalen's calm facade. "Is that so?" Valerius's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I would have thought its file would suggest it was a candidate for immediate purging. The risk of psychic contagion alone is astronomical. You, of all people, should appreciate that particular danger, Kalen, after what happened to your brother." The name Liam, unspoken, screamed in the space between them. Elian felt Kalen's grief flash into a hot, sharp spike of rage, so tightly controlled that it was almost invisible. But Elian felt it. He felt the burn. "My brother's case was unique," Kalen said, his voice dangerously soft. "And I am taking all necessary precautions." "I'm sure you are," Valerius said, her tone dripping with insinuation. "Just be aware, the board is taking a personal interest in this project of yours. They expect a report on your findings soon. Don't disappoint them. We wouldn't want to have to intervene and clean up a sentimental mess." The threat was unmistakable. The screen went blank. Kalen stood motionless for a long moment, his back to Elian. The silence in the room was absolute, but the emotional storm raging within the administrator was deafening. The fortress had been breached. The cold, controlled experiment had just become a desperate, high-stakes gamble. Elian felt a strange, unwelcome sensation rise in his chest. It was a protective instinct, a fierce, sudden urge to shield this man from the cold, sharp presence of the woman on the screen. He took a hesitant step forward. "Administrator," he began, his voice barely a whisper. Kalen turned, and for the first time, Elian saw a crack in the icy mask. His eyes were haunted, the blue depths turbulent with a pain so raw it was shocking. The lie he had been told, "I bought you to set you free," was suddenly cast in a new, more complicated light. It wasn't a lie. It was a prayer, a desperate, impossible hope. "Her name is Director Valerius," Kalen said, his voice flat, stripped of its usual authority. "She was my mentor. She was the one who signed the termination order for my brother." He looked at Elian then, truly looked at him, and Elian saw not a scientist observing a specimen, but a man staring at a ghost. "My brother Liam was an empath," Kalen continued, the words falling like chips of ice. "Like you. The consortium tried to turn him into a weapon. When they couldn't control him, when his abilities became amplified by their methods, they decided he was a threat. They labeled him unstable, hazardous, and they purged him." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't an experiment about the system. It was an act of penance, an attempt to save Elian, to atone for the brother he couldn't. He was not a project, he was a proxy, a stand-in for a dead man. The realization was a cold knife in his gut. The fragile, tentative sense of self he had begun to cultivate shattered. He was not Elian. He was a shadow. He was not being freed. He was being used to quiet the ghosts of a powerful man's past. "So you bought me to fix your mistake," Elian said, the words tasting like ash. "To prove you could save the one you couldn't before." Kalen's composure finally broke. A flicker of raw anguish crossed his face. "Yes," he admitted, the word a confession. "At first. But it is more complicated than that now." "Is it?" Elian shot back, the bitterness he'd held in check for years finally spilling over. "Or am I just a more compliant version of him? A ghost you can finally control?" He turned away from Kalen, from the suffocating weight of his grief and his guilt, and walked to the great window. He stared down at the city, at the millions of lights, the millions of lives moving in blissful ignorance of the cages that hung in the sky. Kalen had promised him freedom, but Elian saw now that the administrator was just as trapped as he was, imprisoned in a past he couldn't escape, chained to a system he both served and despised. And he had dragged Elian into his prison with him. The gilded cage had never felt so small. The beautiful view had never looked so much like the bars of a cell. The conversation with Director Valerius had fractured the delicate, unspoken truce between them. The apartment, once a space of quiet contemplation, now felt charged with tension. Kalen became more withdrawn, the fortress of his mind reinforced, impenetrable. He spent more time at his desk, his fingers flying across the data slate, his posture rigid with a new urgency. Elian felt the change as a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that permeated the atmosphere. The project was no longer a slow, academic exercise. It was a race against a clock he couldn't see. Elian, in turn, retreated into himself. The revelation that he was a proxy for Kalen's dead brother had been a brutal blow. Every kindness, every choice he had been offered, now seemed tainted, a hollow echo of a bargain Kalen had tried to make with fate. The music, the art, the taste of real food, it was all part of an elaborate ritual of atonement, and Elian was the unwilling sacrifice. He stopped exploring. He ate the basic nutrient paste, ignoring the culinary library. He sat in his room for hours, staring at the wall, trying to find the cold, hard place inside himself where he could hide again. But it was gone. Kalen had systematically dismantled his defenses, leaving him raw and exposed. His empathy, now fully awake, was a constant torment. He could feel Kalen's escalating stress, the sharp edges of his fear, the crushing weight of his guilt. It was a relentless psychic noise he couldn't block out. He felt as if he were drowning in the other man's sorrow. One evening, unable to bear the suffocating silence any longer, Elian walked into the main living area. Kalen was at his desk, as usual, but he wasn't working. He was staring at a holographic image hovering above his slate. It was a young man, perhaps in his late teens, with a wide, open smile and eyes the same glacial blue as Kalen's. But where Kalen's were filled with a wintry control, this young man's were bright, with an unreserved warmth. Liam. Kalen didn't seem to notice Elian's presence. He reached out a hand, his fingers stopping just short of the holographic face, trembling slightly. The gesture was one of such profound, naked longing that it stole the breath from Elian's lungs. In that moment, Kalen was not the powerful administrator, the cold scientist. He was just a man, haunted by a love he could no longer touch. "He was younger than you," Kalen said, his voice thick with an emotion Elian had never heard from him before. He lowered his hand and deactivated the image, plunging the corner of the room back into shadow. He believed in the good of the consortium. He thought his gift could help people. He volunteered for the program. Elian said nothing, but he moved closer, an unconscious pull he couldn't resist. "I was the one who encouraged him," Kalen continued, his voice a low, ragged whisper. "I was a rising star in the ministry. I thought I could protect him. I thought my influence, my belief in the system, could shield him from the worst of it." He turned his chair to face Elian, his face etched with shadows in the dim light. "Valerius was my superior. She saw his potential not as a healer, but as a weapon, an interrogation tool. They pushed him, subjected him to brutal conditioning protocols to enhance his range, his sensitivity. They exposed him to the minds of criminals, psychopaths, the very worst of humanity. They wanted him to be a surgical tool for extracting information. Instead, they turned his gift into a curse." The story resonated with Elian's own past, each word a familiar echo. "He started to break," Kalen said, his gaze distant, lost in the memory. He couldn't filter it out. The pain, the madness, it all flowed into him. He became unstable. He lashed out once during a session, put 3 handlers into comas without ever touching them. He flooded them with all the horror he'd been forced to absorb. They called it an unprovoked attack. Kalen's voice was laced with a bitterness so cold it could freeze fire. They labeled him a threat, Valerius. She argued that he was a failed experiment that needed to be erased. I fought her. I used every ounce of my political capital. But I was just a functionary. She was a director. She had the board's ear. He fell silent, the weight of his failure filling the room. I was there when they came for him, he finally said. He looked at me, and I felt it. For the first time, I felt what he was feeling. Not just his fear, but his sense of betrayal. The knowledge that I, his brother, had led him to this. That my faith in the system had been his death sentence. Kalen looked directly at Elian, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. When I saw your file, saw the same pattern repeating, the volatility, the failed conditioning, the decision to sell you off to the highest bidder. I couldn't let it happen again. I had to pull one person out of the machine. I had to prove to myself that it was possible. The confession hung between them, raw and bleeding. Elian finally understood. It wasn't just about atonement. It was about rebellion, a quiet, personal, and profoundly dangerous act of defiance against the system Kalen served. He was trying to save Elian, yes, but he was also trying to save himself from the monster he was complicit in becoming. You think setting me free will fix what they did to him? Elian asked, the question softer now, stripped of its earlier accusation. No, Kalen said, the word heavy with certainty. Nothing can fix that. But it might prove that what they create is not the end of the story. That humanity, once stripped away, can be reclaimed. He stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city. Valerius is not just curious, she's suspicious. She sees my purchase of you as a sentimental weakness, and she despises weakness. She will not let this go. She will use it to consolidate her own power, to prove that her methods are the only ones that guarantee order. She will send someone. When? Elian asked. Soon. She will let me think I am safe. Let me invest more in my project. Then she will strike. The goal will not just be to retrieve you, but to ruin me, to make an example of me. A new dynamic settled between them. They were no longer captor and captive, scientist and subject. They were two men in a cage, waiting for the hunters to arrive. A strange sense of calm descended upon Elian. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but the paralyzing uncertainty was gone. He had an enemy he could see, a threat he could understand, and he was not alone in the cell. The next few days were different. Kalen began to train him. It was not the brutal conditioning of the consortium, but a meticulous, disciplined instruction in control. Your empathy is not a curse, Kalen told him during one session, as they sat on meditation mats in the center of the living room. It is a tool. The consortium tried to use it as a hammer. You must learn to use it as a scalpel. They taught you to block. I will teach you to filter. Kalen guided him through mental exercises, teaching him to build psychic shields that were not solid walls, but permeable membranes. He taught him how to selectively tune into the emotional frequencies around him, to identify a single thread in a cacophony, and to shield himself from the rest. For the first time, Elian began to see his ability not as a source of pain, but as a sense, like sight or hearing, that could be focused and controlled. As he gained control, he became more aware of the subtle nuances of Kalen's inner world. He could feel the deep, abiding grief for Liam, but he could also feel the fierce, protective loyalty Kalen now felt for him. The two emotions were intertwined, a braid of past sorrow and present purpose.
Kalen, in turn, seemed to be changing. The cold detachment was still there, his default setting, but there were moments of unguarded connection. One afternoon, while they were sparring, Kalen insisting that Elian learn a brutally efficient form of close-quarters combat, Elian disarmed him, their bodies colliding. For a brief second, they were chest to chest, Elian's hand on Kalen's arm, Kalen's on his shoulder. The physical contact was a jolt, an electric shock. Through that touch, Elian felt a surge of pure, unfiltered emotion from Kalen. Fear of losing him, a profound and startling tenderness, and a deep-seated loneliness. It was overwhelming. Elian stumbled back, his breath catching. Kalen's mask was instantly back in place, but the moment had happened. The wall between them had been breached. He was no longer just a proxy for Liam. He had become something else to Kalen. Something real. Something the administrator was terrified of naming. The knowledge was as frightening as it was exhilarating. It created a bond between them that was deeper than words, a silent understanding forged in shared trauma and impending danger. Kalen was no longer just his owner or his mentor. He was his shield, and Elian was beginning to realize that he, in turn, was Kalen's. The inevitable came on a rain-lashed night. The sky beyond the window was a dark, churning mass, the city lights blurred and distorted by the sheets of water streaming down the glass. A soft, almost polite chime echoed through the apartment. It wasn't the comms panel. It was the front door. Kalen, who had been cleaning a weapon at the kitchen counter, froze. His eyes met Elian's across the room. The moment they had been preparing for had arrived. "They're here," Kalen said, his voice a low, calm whisper that did not betray the sudden spike of adrenaline Elian felt from him. They didn't try to override the security. They are being theatrical. Valerius's style. He picked up the pulse rifle, its sleek black frame looking like a natural extension of his arm. "Go to your room. Bar the door. Stay away from the window. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." "I can help," Elian said, his own heart pounding. "I can feel them. There are 3 of them. Their minds are blank, shielded, professionally." "That is an order, Elian," Kalen said, using his name for the first time. The sound of it, spoken in Kalen's low, resonant voice, was a shock. It was a plea and a command, a desperate acknowledgement of his humanity in what could be their final moments. He was not Asset 734, he was Elian, and Kalen was going to die to protect him. Kalen walked to the door, the rifle held at a low ready. He took a deep breath, his mind a sudden, perfect calm. A predator's calm. He pressed the panel to open the door. Elian did not go to his room. He flattened himself against the wall of the corridor leading to the living area, his body thrumming with a terrible, focused energy. He would not hide. He would not be a passive victim. Not again. The cage door was opening, and the hunters were coming in. But this time, the prey was ready to bite back. The door slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss, revealing 3 figures clad in tactical gear the color of midnight. They moved with a synchronized, fluid grace that spoke of extensive training and cybernetic enhancement. Their faces were obscured by helmets with polarized visors, rendering them anonymous, inhuman. They were instruments of the state, blades sharpened for a single purpose. The lead figure held a data slate. Administrator Kalen. The voice was electronically modulated, flat and metallic. "By order of the Consortium Board, under the authority of Director Valerius, you are relieved of your duties.
We are here to reclaim misappropriated corporate property. Asset 734. Surrender the asset and you will be taken into custody for review. Kalen didn't answer. His glacial blue eyes scanned the trio, assessing, calculating. The pulse rifle in his hands was steady. Elian, hidden in the corridor, extended his senses. The minds of the agents were shielded, as he'd felt. But it wasn't a perfect shield. It was a technological dampener, designed to block overt psychic intrusion. But his empathy didn't work like that. It didn't read thoughts. It felt the echoes of emotion, the vibrations of intent. And what he felt from them was a cold, disciplined focus. But underneath it, a tightly leashed brutality, a conditioned hunger for violence. Your compliance is the optimal path, the lead agent continued, its tone unchanging. Resistance will be met with terminal force. Valerius never did have a flair for subtlety, Kalen said, his voice dangerously calm. Tell the director her message is received. And with that, he opened fire. The apartment, once a sanctuary of quiet and order, erupted into chaos. The pulse rifle discharged with a sharp, concussive bark, sending a bolt of blue energy searing through the air. The lead agent, impossibly fast, raised a kinetic barrier, the energy bolt splashing against it in a shower of sparks. The other two agents fanned out, one dropping to a knee to lay down suppressing fire, while the other vaulted over the sofa, its movements unnaturally swift. Kalen moved with a lethal economy that was terrifying to behold. He was no longer the detached scholar or the grieving brother. He was a creature of pure combat. He kicked the heavy stone table, sending it sliding across the polished floor to create a makeshift barrier. Plaster and chrome exploded from the walls as the agent's weapons tore through the room, the air filling with the acrid smell of ozone and burnt wiring. Elian watched, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. This was Kalen's world, a world of precise violence and strategic death. He had been a fool to think this man was just a bureaucrat. He was a warrior, and he had built this cage not just to hold Elian, but to be his own perfect, defensible fortress. An agent flanked Kalen's position, moving along the wall with the window. Kalen was pinned down, his attention divided. Elian knew he had to do something. The conditioning screamed at him to stay hidden, to preserve himself, to obey the order he was given. But the man who had given him back a name, who had shown him the sky, was about to be killed. The instinct to protect, the strange, fierce loyalty he felt for his captor, his savior, overrode decades of training. He burst from the corridor. He had no weapon, no armor. He was just a body, a target. But he had his mind. He focused, pushing past the technological dampening, reaching for the agent flanking Kalen. He didn't try to control him. He didn't try to attack. He simply opened the floodgates. He took all the pain, the terror, the hopelessness of his 12 years in the consortium's care, the agony of the conditioning rooms, the despair of the auction block, and he projected it. He gave the agent a pure, undiluted dose of his own trauma. The agent screamed. It was a raw, animal sound of pure agony, utterly incongruous with his technological armor. He dropped his weapon, clawing at his helmet as if to tear his own head open. He collapsed to his knees, his body convulsing, overwhelmed by a psychic feedback loop he was not equipped to handle. The distraction was all Kalen needed. He rose from behind the table, his movements a blur, and fired 2 precise shots. The first took down the agent Elian had incapacitated. The second caught the kneeling agent in the chest, the energy bolt burning through its armor. The lead agent, seeing its squad mates fall, shifted its tactics. It abandoned its rifle, drawing a vibro blade that hummed with a deadly energy. It charged Kalen, its speed a terrifying blur. Kalen met the charge, dropping the spent rifle and drawing his own sidearm. The fight became a brutal, close-quarters dance. The hum of the blade, the crack of the pulse pistol, the sickening thud of armored bodies colliding. It was fast, efficient, and utterly without mercy. Elian felt a sharp, searing pain in his shoulder and cried out, stumbling back. He looked down. A stray shot had grazed him, tearing through his tunic and leaving a smouldering, bloody furrow in his flesh. The pain was a clarifying shock. Kalen heard his cry. His head turned for a fraction of a second, his eyes finding Elian. In that instant of distraction, the agent lunged, the vibro blade slicing through Kalen's defenses and plunging deep into his side. Kalen grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, but his arm was already moving. He pressed the muzzle of his pistol to the agent's helmet just below the visor and fired. The agent's head snapped back, and it collapsed, its systems shorting out with a final, pathetic whine. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the hiss of rain against the window and Kalen's ragged breathing. Kalen slumped against the wall, his hand pressed to the wound in his side. Dark crimson blood seeped between his fingers, a shocking splash of color in the monochrome room. "I told you," he gasped, his voice tight with pain, "to stay in your room." Elian rushed to his side, his own injury forgotten. He knelt, his hands hovering uselessly over the wound. The apartment was in ruins. Smoke hung in the air. The pristine, ordered sanctuary was now a battlefield, littered with bodies and debris. The beautiful cage was shattered. "We have to go," Elian said, his voice trembling. "She'll send more." "She won't," Kalen said, his breathing shallow. This was her one move. She sent her best. Now she'll wait. She'll seal the building, report that I went rogue, that I was killed resisting arrest along with the asset. She'll be a hero. It's clean. He looked at Elian, a faint, ironic smile touching his lips. Almost. Elian grabbed a piece of torn fabric from the sofa and pressed it against Kalen's wound. "We can't stay here." "There's a service conduit," Kalen managed, his eyes beginning to glaze over. "Behind the replicator unit in the kitchen. It leads to the lower levels, an old forgotten part of the Spire's infrastructure. My escape route. Always have an escape route." His carefully constructed world, his life of control, had been predicated on this one possibility. That one day, the system he served would turn on him. Elian hauled Kalen to his feet, draping the administrator's arm over his shoulders. Kalen was heavy, a dead weight, his strength failing fast. The pain in Elian's own shoulder was a fiery counterpoint to the cold dread in his stomach. He half-dragged, half-carried Kalen to the kitchen. The replicator unit was sparking, damaged in the firefight. Behind it, a seamless panel was barely visible. Elian found the release catch, a tiny, hidden indentation. The panel slid open, revealing a dark, narrow shaft filled with pipes and cables descending into blackness. A low-maintenance ladder was bolted to the far wall. The air that wafted up was cool and smelled of dust and ozone. "Go," Kalen whispered, his head slumping against Elian's shoulder. "Leave me. You can make it." "No," Elian said, the word an iron certainty in his own ears. "We get out together." He looked back at the wreckage of the living room, at the panoramic window showing the storm-tossed city. Kalen had brought him here to set him free. He had given him a choice, a name. a chance. Now it was Elian's turn. He would not leave the man who had brought him to die in the ruins of his perfect cage. With a surge of adrenaline, he maneuvered Kalen into the narrow opening. The descent would be hell. Their chances of survival were slim. But as he began to climb down into the darkness, with the dead weight of his savior and captor leaning on him, Elian felt a strange, fierce sense of purpose. He was no longer an asset. He was no longer a victim. He was a man with a choice, and he chose to fight. The freedom Kalen had promised was not a destination. It was the escape itself. The descent was a nightmare of darkness, pain, and whispered encouragement. The service conduit was narrow, claustrophobic, a vertical tomb of pipes and humming conduits. Kalen was a leaden weight, barely conscious, his blood slick and warm on Elian's hands. Elian's own shoulder throbbed with a deep, percussive agony, but he locked the pain away, focusing every ounce of his will on the task. One rung, then the next. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the occasional flicker of a dying service light. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths, the scrape of their boots on metal, and the slow, steady drip of Kalen's blood into the abyss below. "You should have left me," Kalen murmured, his voice a faint rasp against Elian's ear. "Valerius won. She gets what she wants. The asset is eliminated. Her rival is dead. The board promotes her. It's a perfect narrative." "The narrative isn't finished," Elian grunted, his muscles screaming as he shifted Kalen's weight to get a better grip. He extended his senses, not outwards, but inwards, focusing on Kalen. He could feel the man's life force, a flickering flame in the cold wind of his injury. He could feel the pain, sharp and visceral, but underneath it, a surprising lack of fear. There was resignation, regret, but not fear. He was a man who had made his peace with death long ago. That realization angered Elian. It spurred him on. He would not let Kalen have his neat, tragic ending. He would not let Valerius win. They descended for what felt like hours, their world shrinking to the next rung, the next breath. Finally, they reached a maintenance platform, a small metal grill suspended in the darkness. Elian carefully lowered Kalen onto it. The administrator was pale, his skin clammy. The makeshift bandage was soaked through. He was dying. "There's a medical kit," Kalen whispered, his eyes barely open. "In my boot, left boot, in a compartment." Elian found it. A small flat case containing biofoam injectors, sterile patches, and a vial of coagulant. It was a soldier's kit, a fugitive's kit. With trembling hands, Elian cut away the fabric of Kalen's uniform. The wound was deep, ugly. He applied the coagulant and then the biofoam, which hissed as it expanded to fill the wound and seal it. Kalen arched his back, a choked gasp of pain escaping his lips, before slumping back into unconsciousness. Elian used another patch on his own shoulder, the cool rush of anesthetic a blessed relief. He sat in the darkness next to Kalen's still form, the silence of the shaft pressing in on him. He was free of the apartment, but he was trapped in this metal gut of the city, with a dying man as his only companion. The full weight of their situation crashed down on him. They were fugitives. They had no resources, no allies. Kalen was a disgraced, presumed dead administrator. He was an escaped asset, a piece of property that had slipped its leash. The entire city, the entire system would be hunting for him if they knew he was alive. For the first time, the sheer scale of the freedom he'd craved terrified him. In the cage, there had been rules, parameters. Out here, there was nothing but a vast, indifferent world. He looked at Kalen's face, slack and vulnerable in the dim light from a nearby conduit. The man who had held all the power, who had bought him and owned him, was now utterly dependent on him. The reversal was profound. He reached out, his fingers hesitating before gently brushing a strand of silver hair from Kalen's forehead. The contact sent a faint tremor through him. He could feel the deep, rhythmic pulse of Kalen's unconscious mind, the slow, steady hum of a powerful will fighting to hold on to life, and underneath it, the cold, dead star of his grief for Liam. But now, there was something else woven into it, a new warmth, a thread of light in the darkness. It was his own presence, reflected back at him. Kalen's last conscious thoughts had been of him, of his safety. The realization was a quiet, powerful thing. He was not a replacement for the brother Kalen had lost. He was the reason Kalen had chosen to live a different story. He stayed there for hours, guarding Kalen, listening to the hum of the city's hidden machinery. When Kalen finally stirred, his eyes fluttered open, finding aliens in the darkness. "You're still here," he rasped, his voice weak. "I'm still here," Elian confirmed. Kalen tried to sit up, but winced, falling back. The platform connects to the old maglev freight lines, unused since the sector unification. They run deep, all the way to the Undercity. If we can get a transport online, we'll need power, Elian said. And codes. "I have the codes," Kalen said, a hint of his old confidence returning. "Memorized, contingencies for my contingencies." They made their way to the freight lines, a slow, painful journey through darkened tunnels. They found a station, coated in decades of dust, a ghost of the city's past. A single freight transport, a brutalist slab of metal, sat dormant on the tracks. It took them hours, but with Kalen guiding him, his mind sharp despite the pain, Elian managed to divert power from a primary conduit and bring the transport shuddering to life. As they pulled away from the station, moving silently through the forgotten arteries of the city, Kalen looked at Elian. The dim light of the control panel cast his face in shades of green and grey. "I failed," Kalen said, the words heavy. "My home is destroyed. My career is over. Valerius has won, and I have dragged you into my ruin." "You opened the cage door," Elian replied, his eyes on the tunnel rushing past them. "That's not failure," he thought for a moment. "When I was in the facility, they had a name for assets like me, the ones who wouldn't break, who just kept adapting. They called us emergent properties, unforeseen outcomes of the system." He turned to look at Kalen. "That's what we are now, an unforeseen outcome." A faint smile touched Kalen's lips. "I suppose we are." They found sanctuary in a place Kalen knew from his youth, before the ministry, before the city had swallowed everything. It was an abandoned geothermal plant at the edge of the sprawling Undercity, a place of steam and shadow, forgotten by the pristine world above. It was here, in the damp, warm darkness, that they began to heal. Kalen's physical wound closed, the biofoam knitting flesh and muscle back together. Elian's shoulder scarred over. But it was the deeper wounds that took longer. They talked. For the first time, they spoke not as administrator and asset, but as equals. Elian told him of the conditioning, of the white rooms, and the pain, of the way he had learned to make himself small, to hide his own soul in a locked box. Kalen, in turn, filled in the details of Liam's story, of his own complicity, of the slow dawning horror that the system he had dedicated his life to
was fundamentally corrupt. One night, as they sat by the faint glow of a heating conduit, Kalen looked at him, his expression serious. "When I am fully recovered, I will get you out. I still have contacts, off-world resources. I can give you the new identity I promised, the clean slate." Elian met his gaze. The offer was there, the freedom he had been bought for, a life away from the consortium, away from Valerius, away from Kalen and his ghosts. He could walk away, but the thought of it left him feeling empty. He thought of the silent apartment, of the shared danger, of the man who had used his own name for the first time as he went to face death for him. He thought of the bond between them, a strange, powerful thing forged in a crucible of violence and grief. "You said you wanted to understand the cost of the system," Elian said softly. "The cost is what they did to me, to your brother. The cost is the thousands of others still in those facilities. A clean slate for me doesn't change that. It doesn't balance the books." Kalen was silent, watching him. "Valerius thinks we are dead," Elian continued, a new cold fire in his voice. "She thinks she has won. An unforeseen outcome is most dangerous when it is believed to be eliminated." Kalen's eyes widened slightly as he understood. "You are not suggesting—" "She has a network," Elian said, his mind racing. "She has power, but she also has secrets. You know the system, Kalen. You know its weaknesses. And I can feel things. I can feel people. I can tell the loyal from the frightened. I can find the cracks in their shields." The plan began to form between them, an audacious, impossible idea. They would not run. They would not hide. They would fight back, not with weapons and violence, but with information. They would become ghosts in the machine, using Kalen's knowledge of the system and Elian's unique abilities to expose Valerius, to expose the entire asset program. It was a suicide mission, but it was a purpose. "This is not the freedom I intended for you," Kalen said, his voice heavy with conflict. "It is a life of hiding, of danger." "You didn't buy me to give me an easy life," Elian countered. "You bought me to give me a choice, and this is my choice." He held Kalen's gaze. "I will not walk away, not until the books are balanced." In that moment, the transaction that had begun on an auction block was finally complete. Kalen had bought an asset to set it free, only to discover that freedom was not a gift he could bestow. It was something they would have to seize together. He had been unable to let Elian walk away, first out of a possessive need for atonement, then out of a desperate, protective affection. Now he understood. He couldn't let him walk away because their paths were intertwined. One could not be free without the other. He reached out, his hand covering Elian's. The touch was warm, steady, a silent pact. In the darkness beneath the city, two broken men, two emergent properties of a flawed system, chose not to escape, but to become the flaw in the system itself. The cost would be high, but for the first time, the future, however dangerous, was their own.